they said afterward, that she did not hesitate, that when the Duke spoke those words in the great hall of Ashworth, his wife did not flinch, did not colour, did not so much as pause before she moved. The glove lay where Lady Cecilia had dropped it, a pale thing against the polished floor, and everyone in the room understood what it was. Not a glove at all, a test, a public marking of territory. And every eye in that candlelit hall turned to the Duchess to see what she would do. What she did was kneel. She gathered the silk from the floor with fingers as steady as if she were picking up her own embroidery, rose with perfect posture, and handed it to her husband's mistress with a curtsy that was neither deep nor shallow, but precisely correct. And then she walked to the door, not quickly, not slowly, with the particular pace of a woman who has already decided where she is going and sees no reason to rush. By the time the musicians remembered to play, the Duchess of Ashworth was gone, and she would not sleep under that roof again for nearly 2 years. The glove, they said, was white, the kind of white that catches candlelight and holds it. Lady Cecilia Vane had worn it deliberately, had dropped it deliberately, had positioned herself precisely where the Duchess would be standing when the Duke made his announcement about the new conservatory. It was December, the great winter ball, the first the Duke had hosted since his mistress had taken up residence in the house, and every family in the county had come to see what would happen. Not to dance, not to admire the greenery or taste the syllabub, to watch, to witness the particular theatre of a man choosing his mistress over his wife in front of everyone who mattered. When Lady Cecilia dropped the glove, the room held its breath. The mistress had dropped it at the Duchess's feet, not near a servant, not in an empty space. At the feet of the Duke's wife, where retrieving it would require the Duchess to bend, to lower herself, to perform the act of a lady's maid in front of 300 witnesses, and then the Duke spoke. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries further than shouting. "Gather my mistress's glove from the floor." He said it to his wife, to the Duchess of Ashworth, who had borne his name for 4 years and managed his household and saved his Southfields from flooding with a drainage scheme the land agent had called impossible. She did not look at him. That was what struck the guests most powerfully. She did not look at her husband at all. Her gaze moved from the glove on the floor to some middle distance, and then she knelt, and then she rose, and then she handed the silk to Lady Cecilia, with a curtsy that made the mistress look somehow smaller. And then she walked out. If you have ever been made small in a room full of people who were watching, if you have ever had someone speak to you as if you were less than you knew yourself to be, if you have ever felt the particular sting of public diminishment and had to decide in that moment whether to fight or flee or simply walk away with whatever you had left of yourself, then you will understand exactly what she felt. You will understand the ice in her spine and the fire in her throat and the absolute necessity of not letting anyone see either one. You will understand why she did not cry until she was in the carriage, and even then only for a moment while she looked at the ring she had taken off her finger and placed in her palm, considering its weight. The carriage was waiting because she had told her maid to have it ready. Not because she expected this exact humiliation, but because she had understood for weeks that something was coming. A woman learns to read the air in her own house. She learns to note the silences that fall when she enters rooms, the way servants avoid her eyes. Eleanor had read the air for nearly a month, and she had known that the winter ball would bring something she would not be able to ignore. What she had not known was how it would feel to be right. The carriage moved through the December darkness toward the North Road, toward her aunt's house, toward the small, quiet rooms where she would spend the coming months learning to be no one's wife at all. She did not look back at the house, The windows were still blazing with light, music still spilling into the cold night, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had never been meant to live there at all. She had been borrowed, useful for a time, and now the time was over. The ring sat heavy in her palm, the gold still warm from her finger. She closed her hand around it and felt something inside her close as well. Not broken, not shattered, simply shut, like a door that had been left open too long and finally been pulled to. The marriage had been arranged in the particular way that such marriages always are, with ledgers consulted more carefully than hearts. Eleanor Hartley was the daughter of a steward, not a gentleman's daughter at all, but her father had managed 3 neighbouring estates with such competence that his reputation extended well beyond the county. When he fell ill, the question of what to do with his unmarried daughter became pressing. She had no fortune, she had no connections. What she had was the ability to read a set of accounts faster than any land agent the Duke of Ashworth had ever employed, and the Duke's finances required exactly that kind of reading. The old Duke had spent freely and kept records poorly. The estate was mortgaged, the Southfields flooded every spring because the drainage had been neglected for 2 generations. The young Duke, newly come into his title at 23, was discovering that pride could not pay creditors. He needed someone who could fix what was broken. Eleanor Hartley could fix what was broken. The arrangement was simple. She would marry him, manage his household, and put his accounts in order. He would give her his name, a position, and the security her father's death would otherwise have denied her. Neither of them spoke of love. Neither of them expected it. The wedding was quiet, and Eleanor moved into Ashworth House on a grey October morning with 2 trunks of clothing and a leather case full of her father's accounting methods. She was 21 years old. She had never danced at a ball or been presented at court. What she knew how to do was make numbers behave. What she knew how to do was look at a flooded field and calculate the cost of draining it against the value of the crops it would produce. These were not the accomplishments that society valued in a duchess, but they were the accomplishments that saved the Ashworth estate from ruin within 18 months of her arrival. The Duke did not know at first how much of the recovery was her work. The land agent, a man named Pritchard, was careful to present the improvements as his own initiatives. He had learned that dukes did not like to hear that their wives were cleverer than their agents, so when the Southfield stopped flooding, it was Pritchard who received the credit. When the tenant disputes were resolved, it was Pritchard who was praised. Eleanor said nothing. She had not married for credit. She did the work because it needed doing, and because there was a particular satisfaction in watching chaos transform into order under her hands. She worked in the mornings in a small study off the library. She kept her own set of ledgers, meticulous and annotated, and when Pritchard needed guidance, he came to her door and left an hour later with instructions he would present as his own ideas. The Duke, meanwhile, was learning to live with a wife he had not chosen for love. He was not cruel. In those early years, he was merely distant. He dined with her 3 times a week. He asked after her health, but he did not seek her company. He did not confide in her. This was not because of anything she had done. This was because of everything that had happened to him before she arrived. The Duke's mother had wanted a grander match for her son. She had spent his entire childhood reminding him that he was a disappointment, that the true prize of the family was his cousin, Frederick. When the Duke was 19, he had fallen in love with a woman named Louisa Ashby. For 6 months he had allowed himself to hope, and then she had chosen his cousin, Frederick. She had not even told him herself. He had learned of the engagement at a dinner party when Frederick announced it with a smile that suggested he knew exactly how much damage he was inflicting. The Duke had never spoken of Louisa Ashby again. He had locked that door inside himself and converted his grief into policy. Never show regard openly. Never defend what you value. Never be seen wanting what you might lose. This was the man Eleanor had married, not a villain, not a monster, a wounded animal who had learned that the safest way to survive was never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. She did not know this history when she married him. She learned it in pieces over years from servants' gossip and the Dowager Lady Ashworth's occasional sharp remarks and the Duke's own silences, which were sometimes more eloquent than his words. And as she learned it, she began to feel something she had not expected. Sympathy. Understanding even. She understood what it was to be told you were not enough. She understood what it was to build walls around the soft places inside yourself. She understood, better than anyone, that some wounds never fully heal. They simply become familiar, part of the landscape of your own heart. And so she did not push. She did not demand what he could not give. She simply did her work, kept her ledgers, and waited to see if he might some day learn to let someone in. The 3rd year of her marriage was the year she began to hope. It crept up on her slowly, the way frost melts in early spring. The Duke had begun to do small things, nothing dramatic, but Eleanor noticed. She noticed because she had spent 2 years watching him do nothing at all. He had taken to asking for her opinion on estate matters, real questions. Questions about which fields to rotate and whether the new road should curve north or south. The first time he asked, she had been so surprised that she gave him a shorter answer than the question deserved. The second time, she was ready. She gave him her full assessment, complete with figures from memory, and he listened without interrupting. And at the end he said, simply, "That makes sense." 3 words. But she had never heard him say them to anyone about anything that mattered. He had started saying "we." In conversations with Pritchard, in letters to the banker, he had begun to speak of "we" when he meant the estate. It sounded like he meant it. There was a book on his desk that she had recommended, a treatise on agricultural improvement. She had mentioned it in passing during one of their dinners, and he had asked her the title, and she had assumed he was being polite. But a week later the book appeared in his study, and when she saw it, there she felt a small, warm thing turn over in her chest. These were such small evidences. A question asked, a pronoun changed, a book on a desk. They would have meant nothing to anyone else, but Eleanor had learned to read small evidences the way her father had taught her to read ledgers, looking for the patterns beneath the numbers. And the story she thought she was reading was this. He was beginning to see her as a person, as someone whose thoughts mattered. Lady Cecilia Vane arrived in June of that 3rd year. She was the widow of a baronet, wealthy in her own right, beautiful in the sharp-featured way that suggested fox hunts and card games rather than poetry and music. The Duke did not fall in love with Lady Cecilia. Eleanor never believed that he did. What he fell into was something older and more dangerous, the habit of being wanted. Lady Cecilia wanted him openly, admiringly, without any of the complications that came with a wife who had seen his ledgers. She wanted the Duke of Ashworth, the title and the position. She did not want the wounded boy who had been told all his life that he was second best. She did not even know that boy existed, and the Duke, who had spent 3 years learning to trust Eleanor's competence without ever learning to show her his heart, found himself drawn to the simpler thing. It was easier to be admired by a woman who did not know him than to be known by a woman he was beginning to admire. By October, the Duke had stopped saying "we." Eleanor watched the change happen the way you watch weather coming in across a valley, knowing there is nothing you can do to stop it. She did not make scenes. She did not demand explanations. What she did was retreat. And all the while the small warm thing in her chest was cooling into something harder and quieter, a stone where there had been a seed. She would admit later, much later, that she had made a mistake. Not in hoping. Hope had been reasonable given the evidence. Her mistake was in believing that hope, once begun, could survive being proven wrong. She had thought she could watch the Duke turn away from her and simply adjust her expectations downward, returning to the practical arrangement they had started with. She had not understood that you cannot unfeel what you have felt. You cannot unknow what you have come to know. And you cannot pretend that a book on a desk meant nothing when you have already allowed it to mean everything. The months between Lady Cecilia's arrival and the winter ball passed in a blur of quiet endurance. Eleanor continued to work. She continued to attend dinners when required. She continued to manage the household and advise Pritchard and do all the things she had always done, but she did them now with a different feeling, a sense of performing a role rather than living a life. She was a steward's daughter again, doing a steward's work. She had simply forgotten for a little while that this was all she had ever been. The house went quiet after she left. This was the thing the Duke noticed first. It was not that Ashworth House became silent. There were still servants moving through the halls, still Lady Cecilia's voice carrying from the morning room. But there was a particular quality of quiet that had nothing to do with the noise. It was the quiet of something missing. He discovered her competence in layers. The first discovery came 3 days after the ball when Pritchard brought him the estate accounts. The land agent seemed uncertain. He fumbled over explanations he had always delivered smoothly. And when the Duke asked a question about the drainage expenditure, Pritchard admitted that he did not know the answer. Her Grace had always handled that particular calculation. The Duke stared at him. "What do you mean, Her Grace handled it?" Pritchard looked at his boots. "The Duchess, Your Grace. She kept her own set of ledgers. She did the calculations for the drainage and the tenant valuations and the crop rotations. She told me what to tell you. I presented her work as my own. It was what she wanted." "Where are these ledgers?" he asked. And that was how he found himself in Eleanor's study for the first time, looking at the room where she had spent 4 years saving his estate without ever asking for credit. It was a small space, barely larger than a closet. The ledgers were arranged on the lowest shelf. He pulled out the most recent and opened it. Her handwriting was precise and clear, but it was not the handwriting that stopped him. It was the margins. The drainage must be cleared before Michaelmas or the Southfield floods, she had written in tiny script beside a row of figures. This tenant pays late, but always pays. Do not press until February. He had never seen accounts kept like this. Pritchard's ledgers were clean columns of numbers, accurate but lifeless. Eleanor's ledgers were a conversation. She had been talking to herself about his estate for years, working out problems on paper, making plans. He read her margin notes the way another man might read a letter. He spent 3 hours in her study that first day, and he came back the next day and the next. He saw the shape of what she had done. None of it had been obvious or magical. It had been work, her work, careful, meticulous, invisible work that she had never asked him to notice. The Southfields flooded that January. It was the first time in 4 years that they had flooded, and when the Duke demanded to know why, Pritchard confessed that the drainage had not been cleared before Michaelmas. The Duchess had always reminded him. He had not remembered on his own. The Duke stood at the window and looked out at the ruined fields and thought about all the things he had not remembered on his own. The quiet in the house grew louder as the weeks passed. Lady Cecilia was there, filling the spaces with her voice and her plans for redecorating the morning room. But her presence somehow made the absence worse. She did not know where the accounts were kept. She did not understand why the tenants were restless. She was not Eleanor. That was the thought that kept returning, unbidden, unwelcome. And Eleanor was not here because he had made her kneel for a glove. The book on his desk, the treatise on agricultural improvement, was still there. He had been halfway through it when Lady Cecilia arrived and his life rearranged itself around her presence. He had not picked it up since. Now he opened it to the page where he had stopped reading and found a small piece of paper tucked inside. Eleanor's handwriting. Page 94 contradicts itself. Compared to Whitmore's 1793 essay for the correction. She had left him notes. She had been reading ahead, anticipating questions, preparing answers. She had been his partner in everything except the part where he acknowledged her existence. He sat with the book in his hands for a long time, looking at that small piece of paper, at the precise handwriting that had managed his estate and saved his south fields, and never once asked for credit. He thought about all the things he had not seen. He thought about all the questions he had not asked, and he thought, with a heaviness that sat like a stone in his chest, that he had not deserved her, that he had never deserved her. That the glove was simply the moment when she finally understood what he had known all along. He was the kind of man who would let the easier path win every time, even when the easier path meant destroying the only thing worth keeping. The Dowager Lady Ashworth arrived in February, unannounced and uninvited. She was the Duke's great-aunt on his father's side, 82 years old, with the kind of face that suggested she had spent those years finding fault with everyone she met. Lady Cecilia attempted charm. She swept into the drawing-room in her finest silk. The Dowager looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the Duke and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Who is this person, and why is she in your wife's chair?" The Duke opened his mouth to respond. The Dowager did not wait. "I am aware that your mother filled your head with nonsense about what you deserved and what you did not," she continued. "I am aware that some woman broke your heart when you were barely old enough to have one, but I did not expect you to become a fool. There was a glove, I'm told, a glove that belonged to this person, and you made your wife kneel for it. Your wife, the woman who saved your estate from the ruin your father left behind, the woman who has more competence in one hand than you have displayed in your entire tenure as Duke." "You want to know why she left," the Dowager said. "It was not the glove. A woman can survive a glove. It was the fact that you made her pick it up for your mistress. You made your wife serve your mistress in public. And you did it because being cruel to your wife was easier than being honest with your mistress. And that is why she left. Because she finally understood what kind of man she had married." The Dowager rose. "I am tired. You," she pointed at the Duke, "will come and see me at 11 o'clock. We will discuss what you are going to do about this disaster you have created, and you," she turned at last to Lady Cecilia, "will be gone by the time I come downstairs. I do not take meals with the help." But it was not the Dowager's words that finally broke through the walls he had built. It was Thomasina. Thomasina was his ward, the daughter of a distant cousin who had died badly. She was 8 now. She came to his study 3 days after the Dowager's arrival, holding a letter she had written in careful handwriting. "This is for the Duchess," she said. Will you send it to her?" "What does it say?" he asked. "It says that I miss her," Thomasina replied. "It says that I do not understand why she left." The Duke was silent. Thomasina waited. "The Duchess did not want to leave," the Duke said finally. "She had to leave. Why?" "Because I did something that made it impossible for her to stay." "What did you do?" "I made her pick up a glove," he said, "from the floor, in front of everyone, for another lady." Thomasina considered this. "Was she a servant?" "No, she was my wife." "Then why did you make her pick things up from the floor like she was a servant?" The Duke had no answer. "She was just asking," Thomasina said. Her voice had gone small. "The Duchess, I mean." "A few weeks before she left, she asked if I was happy here. She asked if there was anything I needed. She was the only one who ever asked." The Duke felt something shift in his chest. "She asked about you," he repeated. "Every week," Thomasina said. "She came to the nursery every week to see how I was doing. She helped me with my letters. She brought me books. She said that being small and alone in a big house was hard, and she did not want me to feel forgotten." "Will you send the letter?" Thomasina asked. "Yes," the Duke said. "I will send it today." And he did. He wrote a letter of his own to accompany Thomasina's, though he did not know what to say, and spent most of the letter apologizing for not knowing what to say. He sent both letters with the morning post and then spent the rest of the day in Eleanor's study, reading through her ledgers again, looking for evidence of her that he might have missed before. There was always more to find. Notes in margins he had not noticed, calculations so elegant they seemed like poetry, plans for improvements that would not bear fruit for years, decades, long after whoever had planted them was gone. She had been building something. That was what struck him most powerfully. She had not been merely maintaining his estate or preventing its decline. She had been building something, improving it year by year, leaving it better than she had found it. And she had done all of this, knowing that she might never receive credit, knowing that Pritchard would present her work as his own, knowing that her husband barely noticed she existed. What kind of person did that? What kind of person poured themselves into work that no one would ever thank them for? He thought he knew the answer. The same kind of person who asked an orphan ward if she was happy. The same kind of person who planted rose bushes that would bloom long after she was gone. The same kind of person who gathered a glove from the floor without flinching, without crying, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Lady Cecilia did not leave after the Dowager's ultimatum. She stayed, calculating how best to fill the empty space where the Duchess had been. She began giving orders to the household, a different arrangement of flowers, a change to the menu. Lady Cecilia moved into Eleanor's rooms. She did it without asking permission. The Duke came home one afternoon and found Lady Cecilia's belongings arranged in the Duchess's chambers, Lady Cecilia's clothes hanging in the Duchess's wardrobe. "I thought it was time," she said. The rooms were sitting empty. It seemed wasteful. The Duke stood in the doorway. He was thinking about Eleanor's study, the small, cold room where she had spent 4 years doing work that mattered. He was thinking about the margin notes in her ledgers, the evidence of a mind that never stopped solving problems. "You will move back to your own rooms," he said. Lady Cecilia turned. "I beg your pardon. These are the Duchess's rooms. They belong to the Duchess of Ashworth. You are not the Duchess of Ashworth." The smile disappeared. "I am as good as. She is gone. She is not coming back." The Duke was very still. For a moment he saw the future that Lady Cecilia was offering him, a future where Eleanor never returned, a future where he never had to admit that he had been wrong. It was an easier future. It was the kind of future he had always chosen before. What she did for the estate, he said slowly, the accounts, the drainage. Do you know anything about any of that? Lady Cecilia's face went blank. She saved this estate. Did you know that? Did you know that when you dropped your glove at her feet, you were asking the woman who kept this house from ruin to kneel for you like a servant? The Duke walked to the wardrobe, opened the doors, and began removing her clothing. "What are you doing?" Lady Cecilia demanded. "Clearing the Duchess's rooms," the Duke said. "I intend to keep them that way until their rightful owner returns." "You cannot mean to wait for her. She is not coming back." "She looked at you as if you were nothing," Lady Cecilia said. "At the ball, when she picked up my glove. She looked at you as if you were beneath her notice." "Yes," the Duke said. "She did. And she was right." Lady Cecilia stared at him. Her face went through several expressions, none of them flattering. Disbelief, then anger, then a kind of cold calculation as she weighed her options and found them wanting. "You will regret this," she said finally. "You will regret choosing a steward's daughter over me." The Duke continued removing her belongings from the wardrobe. He did not look at her. He did not need to. "I have many regrets," he said. "Choosing her will never be one of them." Lady Cecilia left 3 days later, in a hired carriage, with her trunks piled high and her dignity in ruins. The servants watched her go from the windows. None of them waved. None of them pretended to be sorry. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, remarked to Pritchard afterward that the house already felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. The Duchess's rooms remained empty. The Duke ordered them cleaned and aired and kept ready, as if Eleanor might return at any moment. He did not know if she would. He did not know if he had the right to hope. But he kept the rooms ready anyway because it was the only thing he could do, because she deserved to know that her place was waiting for her, even if she never chose to fill it again. The county assembly was held in April. Lady Cecilia had left Ashworth House 3 weeks after the incident in Eleanor's rooms. She had not gone quietly. She had made it clear to everyone who would listen that she had been wronged, that the Duke had made promises he had not kept. The whispers had spread through the county like fire. By the time the assembly convened, everyone knew some version of the story. They knew that the Duke's wife had left him. They knew that his mistress had left him too. They knew that his Southfields had flooded for the first time in 4 years. Lady Whitmore made the remark that changed everything. During a lull in the proceedings, she turned to her neighbour and said in a voice that carried just far enough, one can hardly blame the poor dear for leaving. Married to that estate for 4 years, doing all the work and getting none of the credit. I hear she managed the accounts herself. Can you imagine? A duchess doing sums. The Duke was on his feet before he knew he was going to move. The room went silent. For a moment he considered sitting down again. He considered letting the remark pass, the way he had let so many remarks pass over the years. But he had spent 3 months in Eleanor's study, reading her ledgers. He had spent 3 months learning what she had done for him. And he could not sit silent while a woman who had never done a useful thing in her life spoke of Eleanor as if she were a servant who had gotten ideas above her station. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was steady. "I believe I misheard Lady Whitmore. I thought I heard her suggest that my wife's competence with estate management was something to be ashamed of." Lady Whitmore's face went pale. The Duke continued, "The Duchess of Ashworth has done more for my estate in 4 years than 3 generations of Ashworth men managed in a lifetime. She redesigned the drainage system that saved our Southfields from flooding. She renegotiated our mortgage at terms that kept us from ruin. She resolved tenant disputes that our land agent had given up on. She did all of this without ever asking for recognition. I did not see it. I am here today to tell you that I should have. The Duchess of Ashworth left my house, he said, because I gave her no reason to stay, because I failed to defend her when defense was required, because I was a coward who found it easier to diminish her than to show the world what she was worth. I am telling you now, in front of everyone, that she is worth more than I deserved. And if she ever chooses to return, I will spend the rest of my life making certain she knows it. He sat down. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone began to applaud. The sound spread until the whole room was clapping, not enthusiastically, but with the particular respect that comes from watching a man admit his failures in public and mean every word. The Duke did not look at anyone. He had not done this for her to know. He had done it because it needed to be done, because defending her was the right thing to do, and he had failed to do the right thing for too long. The ripples of his speech spread through the county in the days that followed. People talked. They always talked. But for the first time, they were talking about Eleanor with admiration rather than pity. The steward's daughter, who had saved an estate. The Duchess, who had been wronged and had left with her dignity intact. The woman whose husband had finally understood what he had lost and had the courage to say so in public. Word reached Eleanor's aunt's house within the week. The aunt, who had her own opinions about the Duke, read the reports with raised eyebrows and then passed them to Eleanor without comment. Eleanor read them in the garden, sitting on the bench beside the climbing rose, and when she finished, she folded the papers carefully and placed them in her pocket. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The aunt understood. Something had shifted. Something that had been closed was now, perhaps, slightly ajar. Not open, not yet, but no longer locked. He went to her aunt's house in May. He simply got on his horse one morning and rode north, through rain that turned the roads to mud, until he reached the small village where Eleanor had been living for 5 months. The aunt's house was modest, a grey stone cottage with a garden that had been carefully tended despite the weather. The aunt answered his knock. "You are the Duke," she said. It was not a question. "I am." "Eleanor is in the garden," the aunt said. "Whether she wishes to see you is another matter." He walked through the small house and out a back door into a garden that was larger than it had looked from the front. Eleanor was kneeling in the dirt, her hands bare, her hair pinned up carelessly. She was planting something. She did not look up when he approached. She finished tamping down the soil, wiped her hands on her apron, and then she rose and turned to face him. She looked well. She looked healthier than she had in the months before the ball, when the strain of watching him with Lady Cecilia had worn lines into her face. The country air had brought colour back to her cheeks. "I heard about the assembly," she said. Her voice was calm, measured. "Yes, you defended me? Yes. In public? Yes." She nodded slowly. "Why?" The Duke had prepared speeches on the long ride north, but standing in front of her, all of those words seemed inadequate. "Because I was wrong," he said. "Because I made you kneel for a glove, and that was cowardice, and I have spent 5 months understanding exactly how much of a coward I was. Because you saved my estate, and I never thanked you. Because you tended my ward, and I never noticed. Because you were my partner in everything that mattered, and I treated you like a servant in front of 300 people. And I did it because it was easier than admitting to myself that I needed you." "Why did you do it?" she asked. "At the ball, why did you tell me to pick up her glove?" "She dropped it at your feet," he said finally. "Lady Cecilia. She did it deliberately, to see what I would do, and in that moment I had a choice. I could have picked it up myself. I could have told a footman to do it, but I was afraid. Of what? Of choosing you, of showing everyone in that room that you mattered to me, of being seen to care about something I might lose. So I chose the path that required no courage at all. I chose to diminish you instead of defending you. You have always been afraid of that, she said, of being seen to want something. Yes. I did not leave because of the glove, she said. I know I left because I understood in that moment that you would always choose the easier path, that you would always diminish me rather than risk being seen to value me. And I could not stay in a house where that was true. Then what do you want from me? I want to ask if you might, some day, consider coming back. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. On what terms? She asked. On yours, the Duke said. Whatever terms you set, whatever proof you require, I am prepared to show you over time that I have changed. You will defend my place, she said finally. Not as an apology, as ordinary habit. Yes, you will acknowledge my work, in the daily running of the household, in the conversations with Pritchard, yes. And you will never, she said, and her voice was very cold now, you will never again ask me to kneel for another woman's glove. No, the Duke said, I will not. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She was searching for something in his face, some evidence of the man he claimed to have become. He did not know what she found there. He only knew that when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been since he arrived. I need time, she said, to think, to decide. You must understand that I cannot simply return because you have asked me to. I need to believe that this is real, that it will last. That the next time Lady Cecilia drops a glove, or the next time some woman requires you to choose between your comfort and my dignity, you will choose differently. I understand, the Duke said. I will wait, for as long as it takes. She nodded. Then she turned and walked back into her aunt's house, and the Duke stood alone in the garden with the wind moving through the plants she had tended, and he thought that he had never been so afraid in his life. Not because she might refuse him, because he might fail her again, because he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that if he was given another chance and squandered it, there would be no third. She did not come back immediately. She required proof, not words, not speeches, proof accumulated over time that the change was real and would last. So he began to prove it. He wrote to her every week. Not love letters, practical letters full of the details she would want to know. The drainage had been cleared before Michaelmas. Pritchard had implemented her suggestion about the tenant valuations. Thomasina had learned to multiply fractions. He included pages from the estate accounts marked with questions in the margins, asking her opinion the way he should have asked it all along. He did not ask when she was coming home. He simply showed her, week by week, that her work was being continued and her judgment was being sought. She wrote back. Her letters were shorter than his, more practical. She corrected his calculations. She suggested improvements to the crop rotation schedule. Once, near the end of summer, she included a sketch of a drainage modification. The Duke took the sketch to Pritchard. When Pritchard asked where it had come from, the Duke said, "The Duchess designed it. She has always designed the drainage. I simply failed to notice until she was no longer here to remind me." It was Thomasina who finally brought Eleanor home. It happened in November, almost a year after the ball. The child had been growing restless for weeks, and then one morning Thomasina appeared in the Duke's study with a proposal. "I want to go and see her," she said. "I want to see the garden she writes about, and the aunt she lives with. Will you take me?" "Yes," he said, "I will take you." They arrived at the aunt's house on a grey November morning, with frost on the ground and the smell of wood smoke in the air. She was at the door when they came through the gate, And then Thomasina broke away from the Duke and ran across the garden and threw herself into Eleanor's arms, and Eleanor caught her and held her. And for the first time since the ball, the Duke saw something break open in her face. It was not a dramatic reunion. There were no speeches, no declarations. There was a child crying into a woman's shoulder and a man standing at the gate watching them. Later, there was tea in the aunt's small parlour, and Thomasina showing Eleanor her latest arithmetic work. It was only at the end of the day, when Thomasina had fallen asleep on the aunt's settee, that Eleanor and the Duke found themselves alone. "You have been writing," she said. "Yes. You have been asking my opinion. Yes. You have been telling Pritchard that the ideas were mine. Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "I have been reading your letters the way you read my ledgers. I will come back," she said. "Not for you. Not yet. For Thomasina, who needs someone to ask if she is happy. For the estate, which needs someone to remember when the drainage should be cleared. For myself, because I have work to do at Ashworth House and I would like to finish it." The Duke nodded. He understood what she was telling him. She was not forgiving him. She was returning to her work, to her responsibilities, to the child who needed her. Whether she would ever return to him was a question that would be answered over months and years of steady proof. "I understand," he said. "Good. Then let us go home." The journey back to Ashworth House was quiet. Thomasina slept against Eleanor's shoulder, worn out from the excitement of the day, and Eleanor looked out the carriage window at the countryside passing by. The Duke watched her. He did not speak. There seemed nothing to say. She had agreed to return, but she had not agreed to forgive him. She had agreed to come home, but she had not agreed to be his wife again, not in any sense that mattered. She was returning to her work, to her responsibilities. Whether she would ever return to him was a question that hung in the air between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, at least for now. When they arrived at Ashworth House, the servants were lined up in the entrance hall to greet her. Mrs. Whitmore had tears in her eyes. Pritchard stood at the back, looking uncomfortable but relieved, the way a man looks when his best secret collaborator has finally been acknowledged. Eleanor greeted them all with the same quiet composure she had always shown, thanking each one by name, asking after their families, remembering details she had no reason to remember about people who had never expected to be remembered. The Duke watched her and thought about all the ways she'd been present in this house, all the invisible threads she had woven through the lives of everyone who lived here. She had not just managed his estate, she had cared for the people in it, and he had not seen any of it until she was gone. They would tell the story for years afterward. The Night of the Glove, they called it, and it became a part of the family history. But the story had a different ending than the one the guests at that winter ball might have expected. The reconciliation took time. It was not a single moment, but a series of moments, accumulated over months like snow building on a hillside. Eleanor returned to Ashworth House in November, to the rooms she had left empty, to the study with the north-facing window where her ledgers still waited on the shelf. She resumed her work. She resumed her dinners with the Duke. She resumed her weekly visits to Thomasina's nursery. But for a long while, that was all. She did not forgive him. She did not pretend that everything was mended. She lived in his house and managed his estate and raised his ward, but she kept a careful distance between them, a space that could not be crossed with words alone. The Duke understood. He had learned that some things could not be rushed, so he did not rush. He simply did, every day, the things he had promised to do. He defended her place in small moments, correcting a guest who spoke of her merchant background, acknowledging her authorship of the drainage plans, introducing her to the tenants as the duchess who had saved the South Fields. He asked her opinion on estate matters as if it were the most natural thing in the world, because it was. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them could have said exactly when it happened, the distance began to close. It was not one moment, it was 100 moments. The first time she laughed at something he said, the first time she reached for his hand across the breakfast table, the first time he found her waiting up for him when he returned late from a tenant emergency, the lamp in her study window burning like a beacon in the darkness. That lamp became a ritual. He never asked her to light it. She never explained why she did. But every night that he was away, the lamp was there, and every night that he returned, he looked for it, and every time he saw it burning, he understood what it meant. She was waiting. She had chosen to wait. The first time she called him by his Christian name again was on a winter evening, 3 months after her return. They had been reviewing the estate accounts together, sitting in her study by the light of a single lamp, when she asked a question about a tenant dispute and, without thinking, used his name instead of his title. She stopped mid-sentence. He looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something that had been building for months, something that neither of them had been willing to name. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. But from that night forward, things were different. The distance was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, narrow and fragile, but a bridge nonetheless. They were crossing it, one careful step at a time. 2 years after the night of the glove, their daughter was born. Thomasina, who was 11 by then, appointed herself the baby's official guardian. The family grew. Not just in numbers, but in something harder to name, a sense of belonging, a sense of having weathered a storm and come out the other side. The Duke learned what it meant to love without fear. Eleanor learned what it meant to be valued without having to prove it. It was not a fairy tale. There were still disagreements, still difficult days, still moments when old wounds ached and old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But they had learned how to weather those moments together. They had learned that repair was not a single act, but a practice, something you did every day, in small ways that no one else might notice. He had learned to ask her opinion not just about the estate, but about everything. He had learned to defend her place not just in public, but in the quiet moments when no one else was watching. He had learned that love was not a feeling you fell into, but a choice you made, over and over, in all the ordinary moments that made up a life. And she had learned to trust him again, not all at once, not without setbacks, but slowly, steadily, the way you learn to trust a bridge that has been rebuilt after a flood. She had learned that people could change, that the walls they built could come down, that the man who had once made her kneel for a glove could become the man who knelt to her every year as a promise renewed. And the night of the glove became not a scar but a story, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything, and how hard they had worked to find their way back. The Dowager Lady Ashworth lived to see the reconciliation, though she never admitted to being pleased about it. She visited every summer until her death at 91, still finding fault with everything, still refusing to take meals with anyone she considered beneath her, which was nearly everyone. But she had a soft spot for Eleanor, and an even softer one for Thomasina, and in her own way she had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The Duke never forgot that. On the anniversary of her death every year, he laid flowers on her grave and stood for a moment in silence, remembering the woman who had told him the truth when no one else would. Lady Cecilia eventually remarried, a minor baron in the next county, and lived out her days in comfortable obscurity. The Duke heard reports of her occasionally, always with the same flat disinterest you might give to news about a distant acquaintance. She had been a chapter in his life, but not an important one. The important chapter was still being written every day in the margins of ledgers and the small gestures of a marriage that had been broken and rebuilt. 15 years after that winter ball, they hosted another one. The same great hall, the same candles blazing. Their daughter was nearly grown, dancing her first formal dance with a young man who looked at her as if she were made of starlight. Thomasina was there too, a young woman now, engaged to a sensible fellow who managed an estate of his own and appreciated her directness. She had grown into a formidable woman, with Eleanor's precision and her own kind of fearlessness, and she credited Eleanor with everything she had become. At her wedding she would say in her toast that the Duchess had taught her the most important lesson she had ever learned, that true dignity was not about being seen, but about knowing your own worth, regardless of what anyone else might think. The guests at the wedding would applaud, Eleanor would cry, the Duke would hold her hand and think, as he often did, about all the ways his life might have gone wrong and all the reasons it had gone right instead. Near the end of the evening, the Duke crossed the room to where Eleanor was standing. She was watching their daughter dance, a small smile on her face. He reached into his coat and withdrew a pair of gloves, white silk, the same shade as the ones Lady Cecilia had worn, though these were new. "May I?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at the gloves. Something moved across her face, a memory of pain transformed into something warmer. The Duke knelt. There in the great hall, in front of 300 guests, he knelt at her feet and held up the gloves with both hands, the way a man might offer a crown. He had done this every year for 14 years, but only in private. This year, he had decided it was time to do it publicly, time to show the world the gesture that had once diminished her, transformed into the gesture that honored her. She took the gloves from his hands. He rose, and the room erupted into applause, not the restrained respect of that county assembly years ago. Joy. The sound of people who had watched this family weather its storm and emerge stronger. The Duke and Duchess stood together in the centre of the room, and he took her hand and she smiled at him with the smile he had spent 15 years earning the right to see. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "what I told you in my aunt's garden?" The Duke nodded. She had told him many things in that garden, but he knew which one she meant. "I told you that you would never again ask me to kneel for another woman's glove," she said. "You did, and you never have." "No." She looked at him. Her eyes were still steady, still brown, still seeing everything. Instead, she said, "You kneel to me." The Duke smiled. It was, he had discovered, the easiest thing in the world. "That is because you are the only woman worth kneeling for," he said. And it was true. It had always been true. He had simply needed to learn how to show it. The musicians began to play. The Duke offered his hand. The Duchess took it. And together, as they had learned to do everything together, they stepped onto the floor and danced.